We've got Kelvin, pronouns he, him, calling in from Floppy Lobsters. Wants to know, does transgenderism, I fucking hate that word, perpetuate stereotypes? This can go one of two ways.
What you got, Kelvin?
Kelvin, you're on the line with Ben and Forrest. How are you doing?
Let me start off by saying totally my bad for that phrasing. Really, I could have done better. That's on me.
I appreciate that sincerely.
Yeah.
Because it does make it sound like a religion, and I hate it. So thank you very much for that.
I hadn't thought of that, and you're completely right on that. So I'm sorry. Didn't mean to come off that way.
That's totally cool. So what's going on? What's your question?
So I decided to call in, first time calling, because I saw specifically the two of you who I know, Dr. Ben, this is potentially part of your lived experiences. And Forrest, you are very well educated on this topic. And I guess my question is, let me try and rephrase it, if you'll allow me.
Yeah, sure.
So does the existence of transgender people and the mindsets transgender people may have kind of go against a lot of societal push towards deconstructing gendered norms?
No. And I can go into this in a lot of depth because, in fact, it goes the opposite. Because the trans community, it is not about adopting femininity or masculinity. It is about like being your true authentic self, whatever that is. And you can be a trans woman and be very masculine presenting and still be a trans woman. You can be a trans man and be very masculine presenting and still be a trans man. You can be a cis man and have be more gender non-conforming and consider yourself to be a femboy. I am friends with people who identify as femboys, who just throw those stereotypes out the window. In fact, a lot of the trans community kind of leans into more gender abolitionism, to where gender is more of your own thing for your own self. And the words that we use around that are for you to communicate with other people. So it would take a lot longer for me to describe every single thing that I am, or explain my whole experience to somebody. But if I say I'm a trans man, they can more easily understand where I come from and, how I want to fit into this society. So I firmly, I reject the idea that the trans community or trans identities perpetuate stereotypes.
Yeah, I think it's really important to point out that, sex and gender are different things. Looking at gender just by the nature of what it is a vast spectrum. But even gender can be broken down further into gender identity and gender expression. Gender identity being your internal sense and feeling of what your gender is and what it means to be man, woman, non-binary, whatever. And then the presentation, the expression that you put out to the world. Both of those things are also deeply spectral. I would argue it's some infinities are bigger than other infinities, and I feel like those are the bigger infinities of this kind of spectrum. And so I'm a cis man. I couldn't tell you what the fuck masculinity means or what it means to me versus somebody else. I can tell you there are certain things that I do that make me feel more manly or masculine, but it's certainly not something that I hang my hat on or hinge any real part of my word. I don't want to say identity, because I guess identity does form into it. It's certainly not as big of a deal to me as it is to other men who it's a very big, there's a reason they don't paint their nails, and there's a reason they're not going to drink tea, and there's all this stuff. And meanwhile, I'm over here just really, it would be very difficult for me to give less of a shit. I really don't. It's just not for me.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, man. I think that with trans people, I'm just seeing my different friends expressing themselves in different ways. And I'm happy to see the same diversity amongst my trans friends as I see amongst my cis friends, because I have plenty of friends who are men and women that express that in different ways and articulate their feelings about that in different ways. And I don't see any real difference in the diversity of those expressions and articulations among them than I do amongst trans people or among myself. It's just everybody's kind of got their own thing going on. And I think trans people are a great exemplar of that.
Okay. Am I still on? I had a phone call earlier, and I think I might have killed my audio.
Yeah, you're still on. I have another point to get to, but I want you to be able to respond to that first.
No, please. You might. I'll address what I want to ask already.
Yeah.
Okay.
So something else too, like there is an interesting dichotomy in performance of gender, and it's not because trans people are encouraging that. It's because trans people have to fit into a society that demands certain gender performance in order to be treated in the way that they want to. So you may see some trans people that have to present as hyper feminine or hyper masculine in certain circumstances in order to be treated with dignity and respect, which is unfortunate that that's the case. But if you are a passing trans person, you're way more likely to be given the pronouns that you normally use, more likely to be called by your correct name and all of that. So there's a societal pressure put onto trans people. Not that trans people want to perpetuate those stereotypes, but it's because society demands those stereotypes be performed in order to be treated like that gender. So I think that might be where there's some confusion.
I think it's also important to point out that, like, because gender is a social construct, like the stereotypes, so to speak, are like, I just to build off what you're saying, Ben, because you already touched on this a little bit, but like just that's something that you are walking into. It's not you're perpetuating it, you are living amongst it. And so it would make sense that the gender specific experiences you have, the gender specific relationships that you have, the gender specific things you see in media, on television, in books, whatever like that, would then influence you to want to also express yourselves in those ways. And so, like, definitely, like when I was a kid, looking at men on TV, looking at men in movies, reading about men in books, like those things influenced the kind of man I wanted to be, as much as they influence just the kind of person I wanted to be. And so, like, it's not that like I'm perpetuating stereotype by my behaviors as a cis man. It's that these stereotypes were given to me and I was then, influenced by them the exact same way that 400 or 500 years ago, men were influenced into the gender behaviors of weeping with emotion and fainting when you're overwhelmed and wearing a powdered wig and makeup and high heels and like all these other very manly things in the 1400s that certainly are not manly today. Kelvin, did we lose you? Going once.
Sorry,
going twice.
Hello.
Oh, there you are. Yep.
Hello. Sorry, phone fell asleep.
That's okay.
I was just saying that. So what this boils down to, from what I'm hearing, is that for a lot of people, since it's not set in stone what it is to be masculine or what it is to be feminine, is that it does, at least to an extent, rely on what certain people's views are and what classifies a person within a certain subset of gendered characteristics.
Well, it's very cultural, and there is a combination of like the way you innately want to express yourself in combination with how you were raised to be, kind of how Forrest is talking. But I think a lot of times the way we talk about gender is a bit misleading, because like we were talking about gender expression and gender identity, so gender identity is more of your psychological sense of self. Well, like when we talk about gender as a like societal construct, a lot of people will say that you don't really have a gender, but you're doing a gender, like you're doing gender in your society, because essentially it's how you interact with the people around you and with the culture around you based on whatever gender means in that society. So
gender performance is what we call in anthropology.
Yeah. So it's like you can have your identity, but you may do gender differently depending on how you want to have those interactions. And so even if like non-binary people have an interesting experience with this, because in a lot of cultures there isn't a way for them to authentically express and like still like it's very hard to perform or like do non-binary gender, because there's such a spectrum, an infinite array of ways that you can be non-binary in a society. And so people often have to sacrifice certain things in order to get the better of the options. So they might not choose to put X on their passport, or they might not choose to use mix instead of Mr. or Miss. They might choose something that's gendered because it's easier to perform that in society and easier to just not have to argue with people on that every single time. And so you can have some ways that you're incoherent with your identity and with your gender performance. But that's not to say that gender is this thing that you have to do one way every single time. But if you want to be treated a certain way in certain societies, you kind of have to go along with the cultural expectation, unless you want to continually fight that battle every day with them. So it's a very complicated, like gender is very complex. And I'd love to get into the meat on this more, but it could take so long. Like there are people who just like do their PhDs in this topic, and it's pretty extensive.
Yeah, I went and pulled out my, this is one of my grad school anthro textbooks. This is from the cultural anthropology section, because I studied all of it just to kind of get a background. And I'm not going to read this whole paragraph because it is quite lengthy, but just kind of jumping in at the end here. Understanding cultural identity is something that people perform, compels anthropologists to think of individuals as agents who have mastered and are capable of executing a range of skills appropriate for the public display of particular identities before particular audiences. Thus, displays of gender identity are examples of gender performativity. That is, gender is something that is reconceived as something that we perform or enact, something that we do, not something that we are. Put otherwise, no single identity fully captures the inner life of any individual. From the perspective of performativity, culture can be reconceived less as a set of imposed beliefs and behaviors, and more of a set of resources, artifacts, actions, and interpretations that can be deployed by individuals in order to enact before others, others the identities which they lay claim. And it goes on and on about this, and it equates this not only to gender, but also to other things like, race and religion and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, just basically we lead gendered lives. We live in a gendered world. We develop gendered brains. We engendered responses and to gendered stimuli. It's all just part of the fun of being a human. There's no like raw body form or brain form or mind form that's like uninfluenced from these things that we can look to as like this perfect unmutilated model of a human being that hasn't been fucked up by society yet. You know what I mean? We don't have that kind of standard. It's just people living in the world, man.
Yep.
With that, I think we're going to move on, Kelvin, but I really appreciate your call. His phone might have fallen asleep again, but I appreciate you, Kelvin. Have an awesome rest of your day. I hope you call in again sometime if you have any more questions.